I used to talk for many years about the Sahaba time, radiallahu anhum, disciples of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, about Umayyad time, Abbasi time, about the Ayyubi time, Nuri times. I mean, I used to talk about those historian intervals too long. But now I decided not anymore. I decided just to talk about the modern history. Why? First of all, the most important reason that the modern history, up to this time that I'm talking to you, it is really influencing us and our societies too much. There are the big influence we are caring about for the modern history. This is a very important reason now. And what happened of the colonial Western, the Western colonial, and they took most of the Arab and Islamic countries. That happened in the modern history. This is the second reason. All of the Islamic groups, they started in the modern history, of course. And the independence of the Muslim countries, it happened also in the modern history, of course. So the conquering, then independence happened in the modern history. So modern history is very, very, very important. The Palestinian case, of course, it happened in the modern history. The fall of the Ottoman Empire happened also in the modern history. So modern history is very, very, very important for all of us to understand and to know. Other reason, and also good reason, that most of the Arabs, maybe most of the Muslims also, they don't know much about the modern history. They know something about the old history, the beginning of Islam, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam time, Al-Rashidin time, Khulafa Al-Rashidin, Khalif's time, Umayyad Khalifs, Abbasi Khalif. They know something about it. But if you ask them about what's happening in the modern history, I say, it's about more than 90% of the people they don't know. They don't know what happened. They don't know how Napoleon came and conquered Egypt. They didn't know how the French came and conquered Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. They did not know how the Dutch came and took the Malay countries, which is today, of course, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Fatani, Philippines. They don't know. They don't know what happened in the African countries, the black African countries, and Germany took some, and Italy took some, French took most of the black countries, England took some. They don't know. They don't know what happened in Palestine. They don't know what happened in Syria. They don't know what happened in Iraq.
So we're going to look at World War I, well, effectively the decade at least of World War I, and it is literally, I cannot underestimate or overemphasize that it is the single most impactful and important decade in the entire 20th century. All of us have been affected by this. All of us. One way or the other we've been affected. Where we live today, the languages we speak today, the state of where we are today in the Muslim world, everything, the entire axis of humanity has shifted in the 20th century, but in this decade, between 1910 to 1919. Everything you can think of happened in that decade. And the Muslim world, of course, suffered the greatest blow that we've suffered for a long time, and that was the end of the Ottoman Empire, towards the end of World War I. So we're going to look at today the Great War. It's an important topic that oftentimes as Muslims, or for those of us who may not be necessarily align ourselves to Western civilization, we tend to think of as being overemphasized in school. They're always talking about World War One. When I turn on History Channel, when it was good, it's not good anymore, but when it was good, it's all about World War One. It's all about the Allies, Central Powers. But it is a topic that cannot be emphasized enough. It really isn't. Unfortunately for the Muslim world, because we tend to have a very isolated perspective on what history is. So Islamic history is only about the Khulafa al-Rashidun, and it's about, at a stretch, we can include the Umayyads, and then we can go on to the Ottomans. But we don't go beyond and look at what's actually shaped our reality today. So the Great War, I would say, is a great jihad. It's the great jihad. In fact, not just one jihad, two jihads. The Germans waged the jihad, and the British waged the jihad, both of them. And on both sides, Muslims were absolutely essential and critical for the success of both sides. So it is literally the great jihad. It's a global jihad that we don't talk about enough. So today we're going to look into that, inshallah, and cover a lot of ground, actually, a lot of ground. So we begin with the New World Order. We need to understand the mentality. La mentalité, as the Annales School of Thought says, you need to understand everything about the era. The customs, the political situation, the language, the mores, everything needs to be understood to contextualize an epoch in history properly. So before we enter World War I, let's look at what led up to World War I. What created the mentality, the zeitgeist of the age that would create a situation that would result in such a global catastrophe. Then we're going to analyze, we're going to go into analytics of the 51 Muslim nations that we picked. Okay, so these 51 Muslim nations before World War I, leading up to World War I, what was the trajectory? What were the state of affairs in these countries? We're going to analyze a number of countries. We're going to analyze today for the first time movements. We have 4 movements we're going to analyze. We're going to score them, we're going to review them, we're going to discuss them. Over the course of this year, we're going to cover, as I said, about 50 movements. So we begin with 4 today, inshallah. Then, as we did last time, a timeline of events from 1900 to 1909. And finally, we're going to add another segment to our presentation, which is obituaries and birth. So year by year, who was born this year, who died this year. Okay, so it's a very comprehensive. You will want to watch it again anyway. You're going to want to watch it again. There is a lot to take in. So the book I'm holding here, the Oxford History of the 20th Century, it's a very concise edition. It's a very concise book, relatively concise, compared to the other books that we have on that topic, which are very thick, very voluminous, and you have various different, I've got a table full of them, just thick, and this is just one volume. Has a lot of detail about the what, the where, the when, and even the how of World War I and the events leading up to World War I. What we don't have is a why. Let's begin with the why. As I said in the Muqaddimah book club, if you're following the book club on Muqaddimah, la raison d'être, the reason for things being. Ibn Khaldun says that oftentimes historians fall into the trap of detailing events to the point to which they forget the reason why it even happened in the first place. Let's analyze the reason why World War I happened, the reason why the world as a whole effectively collapsed. And there is a chapter, even a page, in this book that I'm holding that I recommend every one of us we take time to read. I'm going to break it down here, but I want you to take time, if you have time later on, to read it. Watch the presentation again, download it, read this page. It has all the ingredients. So on page 91 of this book it says, in the early 20th century, colonial empires were associated with the ideas of national greatness, competitiveness, and the survival of the fittest. The colors painted on maps over vast areas of Asia and Africa symbolized national power, prestige, and destiny. This is literally a quote straight out of the Muqaddimah. Prestige is one of the terms he mentions. Power and destiny of the empire. But it all begins in 1885. The Germans were an ascending power. They were a new dynasty, a new empire that was looking to mark its territory on the world. The French, the British, to an extent the Italians, the Spanish, the Portuguese, had had centuries in advance to colonize and conquer and to pillage world civilizations. But the Germans had only come onto the scene. So in 1885, we can see the pictures on the right side of the presentation. We have a conference that happens in Germany. Otto von Bismarck, which is the first secretary of this new German empire, arranges for the European heads and ambassadors to come to his residence in Berlin, and they have a conference. The conference topic is how we're going to carve Africa. They decide for themselves that they're going to divide Africa between themselves without consulting the African leaders or the African people. They've just decided we're going to carve this continent between us, but in order to avoid conflict and fighting one another, let's come around the table and let's discuss how we're going to divide this. So you can see on the right, the top picture, there's a map of Africa, and there were people pointing towards it. Okay, this is the beginning of the nightmare.
Cameras begin their turning in Berlin. One of the earliest motion pictures finds Prince von Bismarck exhorting the Germans to love blood and iron.
It doesn't begin only in Africa and end there. It actually extends across different continents. Asia specifically, Middle East. Right? All of these nations eventually fall under this race to conquer, because there is a competition among these nations to conquer as much as they can and to claim as much as they can, because it reflects upon their national greatness. So Otto von Bismarck was the guy who effectively sparked this race in 1885. It begins there. Now the importance of the words utilized here are very, very key, because it says competitiveness and the survival of the fittest. What does that remind you of, these statements? Survival of the fittest. What theory, what worldview? Yes. Yes. I want you to keep this in mind. Oftentimes, when we talk of colonization, when we talk of Western imperialism, we think of military. We think of sometimes financial exploitation. What we don't think of is the ideology behind that is linked to social Darwinism, or the biological element of evolution. One of the major driving forces behind this campaign is Darwinism. And we're going to unpack how that actually is the foundation of all of this. So here we see the statue that's been actually effectively dishonored or disrespected of a very famous, infamous, I would say, emperor or leader, European leader. Does anyone know who this man is?
The second.
Leopold II, yes.
The Belgian.
Yes. Now, let's read what this page continues to say, because it's very important. And this, for me, was very fascinating, because it captures everything in there. Colonies seemed to enrich national character and to encapsulate national glory. So we talk of national character and glory. We're not talking about the colonies themselves, we're talking about the colonizer. Right? We're talking about the colonizer. So every time France scores a point on the map, it's literally a game for them. It's literally a game. The great game. The great game. They're scoring points on the map. I've conquered this part. I've conquered that part. I've conquered this part. I've conquered that part. With each point they score, it increases the prestige of the nation. It increases their among the other nations in Europe, how people see them. So national character and glory is attached to conquering as much land as possible in Africa to begin with. The natives were to be civilized, while the raw materials and other resources of the colonies would benefit the economy of the metropolitan country. So the natives, the people who actually lived in these lands, were to be civilized. And so it was a civilizational project. And when we go to places such as Congo, one of the worst affected areas, in fact Congo was one of the worst examples of what this ideology could actually inflict upon people. Leopold II effectively, he pillaged the entire country. He mutilated millions of people. He killed innumerable amounts of people who actually died at his hands. And we talk of oftentimes of Hitler, this man was worse than Hitler. On all counts, was worse than Hitler. But in the process of being there and civilizing the natives, a new ideology evolves. So even later on, when he's taken out of power, when he passes away, there's an after effect amongst the people who are there. Amongst the people in Congo at the time, there was a term called évoluer. And again, it's attached to the idea of survival of the fittest. Évoluer was something that they would call somebody who spoke European languages, who dressed like the European master, and who espoused the beliefs and the principles of the colonizer. That man, that African, would go from being a native to being évolué. He evolved, literally he evolved. This term was utilized, he evolved. Right? So in other words, he has passed the test, he's now a full human being.
Please, I just want to go.
Now, don't try to kid me, man cub. I'll make a deal with you. What I desire is man's red fire to make my dream come true. Now give me the secret, man cub. Come on, show me what to do. Give me the power of man's red flower so I can be like you. Oh, Obi-Do, I want to be like you. I want to walk like you, talk like you too. You'll see it's true. Someone like me can learn to be like someone like you. Now you might think it's ridiculous that me, a Gigantopithecus, would ever dream I'd like to team with the likes of you, man cub. But together we'd have powers, all the jungle's treasures ours. I got desire, you got the fire, but the dream I dream takes two. So, I want to be like you. I want to use that flame just the same as you can do. Oh, how magnificent it would be. A Gigantopithecus like me could learn to do like you humans do.
And so the people were being not only exploited of their resources, but also of their culture, their language, their civilization. What made them who they were was being taken away from them. All in the name of what? The development of human species, the evolution of human species. They literally believe this. Right? So later on what we find is technological advance made it easy to believe in human progress throughout the world. Yet at the same time, humankind seemed trapped in an evolutionary struggle. When Darwin wrote his book, he talks of the white races inevitably having to conquer the darker races because of their advantage, the privilege they have. So biologically speaking, there's an advantage, they're more evolved. So in the interest of everyone, they would have to conquer the darker races. And so this evolutionary struggle between the colonizer and the colonized really begins to take place and take root, and really we can see the effects in the late 19th century. But it doesn't stop there, it continues, because we need to work all the way up to 1914. The Origin of Species is a short title, it's more palatable, but the original title, published in 1859 by Darwin, was on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Let me repeat that. The origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, and this was published in 1859. So it wasn't too long before the conference they had in Germany. So according to this principle, which became social Darwinism, only the fittest nations and the fittest empires would survive. Great powers should possess great empires, if necessary, at the expense of lesser empires. The possession of the weaker colonial powers would be absorbed by the stronger, just as the territories of the dying nations of Turkey and China would be annexed by the more virile European nations. So by this point it was just a matter of fact. strong nations devour weak nations, and the dying empires such as the Turkish Ottoman Empire would inevitably be annexed. At the time they used to call it the sick man of Europe. So it was just a fact for them. It wasn't even a discussion, it was just a fact that as a great nation, as great European nations, we just have to go and conquer, because it's the survival of the fittest. We have to survive. May the best man win. But this caused many problems, because you have one part of the world that has this mentality of conflict and imposition and competition, and you have other parts of the world that don't have that mentality. They don't have that competitive edge or that idea of dominating other people. And so what we see in the 20th century is effectively these two coming together, and on one side a ruthless campaign to conquer, to survive, to dominate. On the other side, people are still thinking, what's going on here? Right? They don't understand the full impact of what's happening. But the ideological foundations come from Darwin, who takes it from a famous man known as Thomas Malthus. If you have the 100 most influential people in history by Michael Hart, Malthus is in there. He's mentioned there because of his theory. The theory he wrote about was that human beings, natural resources grow typically incrementally. So resource, food, whatever we survive on, grows incrementally. But the human population grows exponentially. And for that reason, if we don't control populations, we will run out of resources. To make it simpler, the resources we have on Earth are not growing as fast as the number of people. And so in order for us to survive as a species, some human beings have to be culled, effectively. This discussion, by the way, is still going on, because we know what happened a few years ago with Bill Gates and his injections. They want to minimize the population, especially populations that are considered less worthy than other populations. So from this idea that he proposed and he started writing about, the idea of competition between races began. Because if you have limited resources and a growing human population, a burgeoning population, at some point we're going to run out of resources. So who has the right to survive? The fittest. And so this race begins. This race begins. But unfortunately, as I said, the outcomes are catastrophic. So the European nations have this mentality of competition, limited resources, growing populations. How do we manage? In Europe, for example, in Britain, because of this theory from Malthus, in some of the most impoverished quarters of London, I'm talking of London here, when they were planning cities, they would build them in certain ways and neighborhoods that would promote the spread of disease on purpose. Why would they do that? These were underprivileged communities. They didn't really have much value for society. So creating an environment where disease spreads easily is a way of culling those communities. It's a natural way of what? Culling the communities. Right? If you remember, a couple of years ago, we also had the Grenfell Tower incident. And one of the criticism was that these are poor people. And that is why you've allowed for them to live under those circumstances, which were very, very detrimental, because you don't value these people. In fact, it may actually benefit you to actually have them out of the way so you can build. So this idea of building poorly so that the impoverished society doesn't survive comes from this idea again. How do we minimize the population? How do we make sure that it is less? And for those who remain, there's a competition perpetually for resources. It's a very dangerous foundation. Whereas in Islam, the Muslim perspective is we have an abundance of resources. There is no competition. The provider, Ar-Razzaq, provides for everyone, and his stores are never empty. So there is no competition to see who can get the most quickly at the expense of another. But the worldview we're going to look into actually is based on this. This premise is there, and to this very day we have the same premise. So the population of Muslims globally is a concern for many people. The birth rates amongst Muslims is a fear for many people. The population of Africa is a concern for many people. It's always linked to resources. We don't have enough resources for these people. So the project really continues effectively. And we can see here that what evolved from this is what is known as social Darwinism. So from the scientific base, or the pseudo-scientific base, you have a sociological phenomena, social Darwinism. The obsession with classifying human beings according to races, to groups, to social strata, and then the competitiveness that follows with that. Who can get the most resources, who can get it quicker, who doesn't deserve the resources, so on and so forth. So social Darwinism is born of this. And later on in the century, you find, for example, the Germans take it to another level. The Germans take it to another level. What the Europeans, the Western Europeans, France and Britain and Italy did initially was to conquer physically, but the Germans took it to another level with eugenics. We find that they take it to the level whereby they're actively and proactively trying to create and cultivate the fittest of the fittest. And those who don't meet that standard are literally killed. Yeah. So when we talk of Darwinism as being a fact or a science, we need to look at the fundamental principles. And what does it produce? What has it produced for humanity over the centuries? Here we see also, based on the same principle, you have various books have been written, very famous books actually. The Bell Curve is one of those books, which places the darker races towards the bottom of the IQ curve, and the whiter Aryan races at the top. It's a very controversial book that's caused much discussion. You know, they're still trying to prove that certain races are naturally less intelligent than others. Measuring skulls. If you look at Leopold, when he was actually ruling Congo, they had literal human skulls, and you had anthropologists coming to measure the skulls to try and prove or disprove these theories. So it's literally a religion at this point. It's an ideology that's really got out of control. The Germans, this is a German propaganda piece, only healthy seed must be sown. Okay? Eugenics, check the seeds of heredity. So this is effectively saying the Germans at that time were actively looking to find ways to create a superior human being with the best possible genes. Blonde eyes, blonde hair, blue eyes, we know the whole story, right? But they took it to the absolute limits. If this is the reality of humanity, we need to have the best, the highest quality of human being. And as a result of that, look at the catastrophe that happened, even within their own nation. So it gives birth to many, many, many deplorable ideas and deplorable projects, but it doesn't end there. The drive for empire contributed to a spirit of ruthless militarism. So because they were indoctrinated and they believed in these ideas of superiority, أنا خير منه, I'm better than him, which we know where that came from. I have a better composition, better genes, I'm more intelligent, I have a better origin, I am better than him. That mentality created a ruthlessness that would inflict the rest of humanity. For those of you who are a bit squeamish, I would advise you turn away or you don't look. The following images are depicting what happened in Algeria, one of the first places to be colonized following this massive project. Unfortunately for the Algerian population, they were subjected to almost 100 years of absolute terror. Absolute terror. And believe me, the images I'm showing you here are light. They are light compared to the full catalogue of what's available online. I would not recommend you go and look into it. But if you look at the soldiers smiling here, for them this is just normal. They have no problem because they've been indoctrinated. They believe genuinely that they are superior specimens of humanity. And the people they're dealing with, men and women, nobody's saved. Men and women are just natives who need to be civilized. And so this ruthlessness is what they come to Africa and Asia and the Middle East with. And the result of it is colonization, ruthless colonization. When they arrived in in Libya, Italians entered Tripoli. Some of the shuyukh would say there's no point fighting these people, they are invincible. Yeah. Because of the sheer terror inflicted and the lack of humanity inflicted. They did not see these people as human beings. at all. And they saw their mission as one that was necessary for the continuation of humanity and the balance in humanity. So it's an ideological movement before it is a military movement. But the science, or the pseudoscience, justifies why it's okay to treat people like this. And there are many other examples. The beginning of the century, in that sense, represents a Rubicon from which there could be no return. But the Rubicon, or crossing the Rubicon, is a historical phrase. It's an instance in which Julius Caesar, he was a governor, and when the end of his term came, typically the senators would call you back. So you've served your term as a governor, you need to come back to Rome for your next assignment. But the rule was you were not allowed to come back with your soldiers into Rome, because that's a potential threat. If you bring your soldiers into Rome, it's a potential threat to security, so on and so forth. So the governor would come back without any army. Caesar decides to do the opposite. He decides he's going to enter with his army, which is a sign of confrontation. It's a sign of potentially war. Prior to Caesar, no one had ever done that. But Caesar decides he's going to enter Rome with his army. And when he comes to the bordering region between where he was governing and where Rome was, there was a river called the Rubicon. And so he's looking at the river, and his soldiers are looking at the river thinking he's going to cross it, because once he crosses the river, he's entered Roman territory. That's an act of treason, a declaration of war. And effectively, there's no going back. Once you cross the Rubicon, there's no going back. Okay, so that's what the phrase means. So in this book, they said that the beginning of the century, the 20th century, was the Rubicon. And once that was crossed, there's no going back. There is no going back. Life as we knew it before will never be the same again. The entire world has been changed. There's no going back to the old ways. Indigenous societies would never be allowed to continue their own natural evolution. The traditions that people had, how they ruled over themselves, how they governed, how they organized their tribes, the maps that we have today do not represent any of the natural organizations. It's just a grouping of people based on France wants this part, England wants that part. So what it used to be will never go back to what it is. Never ever. They will be modernized and in some cases assimilated. Imperialism would be the engine of social and economic change. And so from 1900 onwards, the world literally took on a new character. And there is no going back. There is no going back to what it used to be. I want you to ask yourself this question. If you are native to France, to Italy, to the UK, to any of these nations in the West, how would your life look like today had your governments never left and gone to colonize Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and other parts of South America? How do you think your life would be, your customs, your daily activities, the resources you have access to? How do you think that would look like today? And it's a very uncomfortable question. Just ask yourself, how do you think your economy would look like today if you did not have access to those resources in those lands? If things were as they were in 1850 and remained that way, how would Europe be today? And for those of us who are from the other side of the equation, how would our places look like today if there was no colonization? If there was no survival of the fittest? If they just left those lands to be as they were, to rule themselves as they were ruling themselves, how would things look today? I can guarantee you one thing. We will not have the imbalance we have in the world today. I promise you that. The imbalance we have in the world today, where you have large populations that are impoverished despite having natural resources in their land, and you have populations that have no resources but have all of the finance and all of the leverage in the world, things would be very different. So we crossed the Rubicon in 1900, and things, as according to this analysis, will never go back to how they were. The best we can hope for is modernization, and in some cases a simulation that the conquered people would evolve to the status of the conqueror. And as we traverse the rest of the century, we're going to see that attempt at sometimes some of the Muslim thinkers and ideologues will begin to talk of modernizing and evolving or catching up to the West, right? The best we can do is to be like them, right? Imperialism would be the engine of social and economic change. Very profound. Social because how we carry ourselves, what we've deemed valuable, what we aspire to, sometimes how we dress, how we look at the world, from what perspective, all of that has been changed. Our economics, I don't even have to explain the economic status. You know, if you speak to people who lived 50, 60 years ago, they'll tell you. I had friends that would tell me that Nigeria, 50, 60 years ago, the currency was far greater than the British pound. You have people who come from Somalia who will tell you the same thing. 50, 60 years ago, Somalia was a completely different world. You could see the pictures, you could see the development, you could see the people happy. And many other places similar to that. But things changed. And what we see today is actually our reality. We've come to accept it. And for many of us, the best we can hope for is to resemble or to evolve into the conqueror. So that's the first part, just to understand before we get into the rest of it. It was a process that began in the 19th century. And the ideological foundation was the concept of resources being limited, races and nations competing for resources, and the great game among the European nations.
Welcome to HistoryUn, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. To discover the HistoryUn mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.historyun.com.